Mr. Tickle by Roger Hargreaves. It was a warm, sunny morning. In his small house on the other side of the forest, Mr. Tickle was asleep. You didn't know that there was such a thing as a tickle, did you? Well, there is. Tickles are small and round, and they have arms that stretch and stretch and stretch. Extraordinarily long arms. And here's Mr. Tickle's house. Mr. Tickle was fast asleep. He was having a dream. It must have been a very funny dream, because it made him laugh out loud, and that woke him up. He sat up in bed, stretched his extraordinarily long arms, and yawned an enormous yawn. Mr. Tickle felt hungry, so do you know what he did? Here's Mr. Tickle, fast asleep in his bed. What did he do? What's he gonna do? He reached out one of his extraordinarily long arms. I keep saying extraordinarily, but it's actually extraordinary. Please. Extraordinary long arms opened the bedroom door, reached down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, reached into the kitchen cupboard, opened the cookie jar, took out a cookie, brought it back upstairs, in through the bedroom door, and back to his bed. Very long sentence there. Passed by commas to give the impression of length. As you can see, it's very useful indeed, having arms as long as Mr. Tickle's. Mr. Tickle munched his cookie. He looked out of the window. Today looks very much like a tickling day, he thought to himself. This guy. And there's the cookie in question. So later that morning, after Mr. Tickle had made his bed and cooked his breakfast, he set off. He makes his bed and cooks his breakfast. He set off through the forest. As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle. Looking for anybody to tickle. This guy. You can see he's ecstatic at the idea of his working day. He's off to work to tickle. Eventually Mr. Tickle came to a school. What's going to happen now? There was nobody around, so, reaching his extraordinary long arms up to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeked in through the open window. Inside he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks, and a teacher writing on the blackboard. This isn't going to go down well, I can sense. This isn't going to go down well at all. Phew. Mr. Tickle waited a minute and then reached in through the window. Mr. Tickle's extraordinary long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned around very quickly to see who was there, but there was nobody there. the tickler in question, Tickle, the Tickle monster, the Tickle fiend. Bloody hell. Fuck. Ash everywhere. Mr. Tickle grinned a mischievous grin. He waited another minute and then tickled the teacher again. This time he kept tickling until the teacher was laughing and saying, "Stop it," over and over again. All the children were laughing too. It's such a funny sight. There was a terrible pandemonium, a word coined by Milton there. And then we got the kids in glee that chaos is ensuing. Eventually Mr. Tickle thought that he had had enough fun, so he gave the teacher one more tickle for luck, and then, very quietly, brought his arm back through the open window. Chuckling to himself, he jumped down from the window, leaving the poor teacher to explain what it was all about. Which of course he couldn't. Then Mr. Tickle went to town. There's the bastard. Off to town. And what a day Mr. Tickle had. He tickled the policeman on traffic duty in the middle of town. It caused an enormous traffic jam. He tickled the greengrocer just as he was piling apples neatly in his shop window. The greengrocer fell over backward, and the apples rolled all over the shop. Really, Mr. Tickle has some big, chaotic neutral energy right here. At the railroad station, the guard was about to wave his flag for the train to leave. As he lifted his arm in the air, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And every time he tried to wave his flag, Mr. Tickle tickled him until the train was 10 minutes late, leaving the station, and all the passengers were furious. That day Mr. Tickle tickled everybody. He tickled the doctor. He tickled the butcher. Nice little specifics, yeah. Blake said something about specifics as well. He tickled the doctor. He tickled the butcher. He even tickled old Mr. Stamp, the postman, who dropped all his letters into a puddle. Mr. Stamp. Then Mr. Tickle went home. Sitting in his armchair in his small house on the other side of the forest. Remind that he's on the other side of the forest. There's a deep meaning to that phrase. He laughed and laughed every time he thought about all the people he had tickled. So, if you are in any way ticklish, beware of Mr. Tickle and those extraordinary long arms of his. Just think. Perhaps he's somewhere around at this very moment when you're reading this book. Perhaps that extraordinary long arm of his is already creeping up to the door of this room. Perhaps it's opening the door now and coming into the room. Perhaps, before you know what is happening, you will really and truly be tickled. Incredible. A very good book. Mr. Tickle, it's funny, he never gets his comeuppance. He lives each day in a kind of perpetual present, tickling. I see him as a kind of spirit, a spirit of the forest, a very pagan primordial spirit, a mischievous god, Mr. Tickle. He exists on the other side of the forest, so he exists in, let's say, the spirit realm. He exists in something akin to the Aboriginal concept of the dreaming, the axis mundi. Mr. Tickle comes from the spirit realm and wreaks havoc in our world. He's yeah. It's funny because the use of that there's a distinct lack of consequence to anything that Mr. Tickle does. He exists purely to tickle. He's probably millions of years old, maybe even billions. He was probably the first thing, really. He is the original tickle that led to all of the vibrant matter that surrounds us. Mr. Tickle. See, I've got this kind of fake gun. It's my mum's. Sometimes I wake up and I pretend it's a real gun, I pretend it's loaded, and I just hold it to my head for a second, thinking about if it was a real gun and I was on the verge of pulling the trigger. Could I shoot it? Would I shoot it? Would I let go? There'd be so many things I'd have to say goodbye to before I left. Sometimes I cry and I don't pull it, but maybe I'm just gonna pull it. Maybe I just do it now. Maybe I just do it. It's the tickle. I think about what's gonna be on the other side. Really, what would happen? I just see blackness. I just see it all turn to darkness. I can't do it. I can't pull it. Don't have it in me.